Hello there. Alright, so in today's video we'll be talking about tests. And the motivation behind tests is that while you might know that your code compiles, how can you be sure that it's working correctly? And we do that through testing. Now, I'm going to try to make this video as short as I can because I think that really the best way to learn tests is for you to implement a library, then we'll test it. So here I'll just sort of give you a head start on, I guess, how to set it up. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so to start off, when we talked about modules and we created a new library, you saw that we were giving this initial piece of code. Now I told that we should ignore it because we'll talk about it later, and now's the time. So, okay, so for now let's ignore this first two lines, and I want you to see that here we're using the test attribute. So same idea when we used the derive attribute, in which we did say derive debug. Okay, so same idea. It's an attribute, and this is what marks this function as a test function. And what that means is that we can now come to the terminal and we can do cargo test. By doing cargo test, you'll see that our test for the module tests function, it works, ran okay. 1 passed, 0 failed, 0 ignored, 0 measured, and 0 filtered out. We'll be going over some of these as we go on in the video. Other than this section, we see doc tests. This is for documentation tests. We won't really be going over them in this video, but I'll be talking about them in the future. And yeah, so that's sort of a general way of understanding it. Let's actually understand what's happening in this function and create some more complex examples. Okay, so inside this function we see that we're using this macros called assert equality. And this is just really a more general way of the, or I guess more specific way of the assert macros, which its idea is that it will receive a Boolean value, and if it's true, the code continues, the test passes. If it's false, then the code panics and we get a fail. So in here, say, before we had 2 plus 2 equals 4, we can say 2 plus 2 equals 4. And now when we save and we run, we cargo test it, we'll see that it works just the same. Okay. Say that we wanted to fail this test and then run it. We see that we get a failed, and we also get our panic message. So in saying assertion failed at 2 plus 3 equals 4. Okay. Yeah, so assert equals, considering this is such a common programming pattern, they just created this function which allows you to, instead of having the equals equals, create a comma. Okay, so you can, again, just run it, and the message will be a little bit different. You see that it says that the left side is 5 and the right side is 4. They're not equal, so it fails. Okay. So yeah, equally you have the not equals. So here we do want it to not be equal, so this will not panic and the test will pass. See that if we run cargo test, it passes. Okay. Yeah, I guess one last thing is that whatever you're comparing, you need to have it implement the partial equivalence trait. Okay, so what I'm saying is you must implement partial EQ. Okay, just so that you can actually compare. All right, and that's it for assert macros. Actually, one last thing I thought would be cool to show you is that if you go to the Rust-Lang documentation for partial equivalence, you'll see that it actually tells you specifically how to implement this partial equality for your own types. So in here you have an enum book, and to compare books, or I guess a struct book, and to compare books, it is comparing them by the ISBN. Okay, so you can do the same for your own functions, and then you can test everything. And other than that, something else you can do is that you can add your own custom error messages. So as we know, on our assert function, if we do equals equals and we cargo test it, we see that we get this error message, right? This is our panic message. But say that I'm not satisfied with that, what I can do is I can add extra arguments here. And whatever extra arguments I write will be passed on to the format macros. And what that means is that I can use placeholder values. So say that instead I want to pass this on to a left value, and then here I want to pass it on to a right value, and then here I just want to compare left equals right. In here I can say left equals placeholder and right equals placeholder. So this will be able to, this will allow me to better understand error messages in more complicated cases. So if I come back here and I cargo test it, you'll see that we get our error message in the panic message instead. Okay, so I think that's it for the assert macros for real this time. Okay, so right here, we know that our code will panic. So what if that's the expected behavior, right? So what if we do want it to panic, and that's when we want to pass the test? So something that Rust allows us to do is to use the should panic attribute. Now again, you put this before your function, which means that this test function must panic, and that's what I want to pass. So right here, right now, if we cargo test, we should get an OK. Right, so it is panicking, so we're good. Now, of course, as you can probably guess, should panic is not the most precise of things all the time, because we could be getting another panic and still it would pass. And so we might be getting unexpected behavior. A way to remedy this is that we can say expected equals, and then the error message we're expecting. So in this case, it will be something like this, right? And then we can say 5 and 4. So right now, if we cargo test it, we see that we get an OK. But say that instead, we weren't expecting an error message, or rather, we're expecting this message, but instead, here we say 100. Okay, and we cargo test it, see we get a fail, because we didn't get the error message that we were expecting. Okay. One last thing I want to point out is that the should panic, to use should panic, you must return an empty tuple. So in the next section of this video, we'll be talking about using result for testing functions. But say that in here, I want to return, give you a little bit of a spoiler, I want to return result, and then say a string. Okay. Now right here, you'll see that we get an error, and the error says, hopefully we get the error, and there you go. Functions using should panic must return empty tuple. Okay. So yeah, keep that in mind when you're making your test functions, and return something like this. Okay. Now let's get into the result stuff. Not sure if I mentioned this in the beginning of the video, but if I did a recap, the assert function, if it's true, we just pass. If it's false, it panics. Right? So even another way to run tests is we can have several ifs, else, and eventually we could just panic, right? We can just say, okay. Now, as it is, this code will always panic, so if we cargo test it, cargo test, it fails, right? Of course. But another way that's a common practice in running testing functions, instead of panicking, we can use result. So we can return a result. Here I'll return an empty tuple and a string. And of course, we want to remove the should panic because we can't use this result type, and say, I don't know, here I'll just say if, or let's create a variable x called bind the value of 1. Let's create a variable y, bind the value of 2. If x is larger than y, we return an OK, else we return an error saying error. Now if we cargo test this, we'll get a failed, or rather, we'll get, oh, I forgot to string it. I guess we did get an error, but we'll get a failed. There we go. So failed. And yeah, this is another common practice in writing testing functions. You can use either or, whatever works best for your project. Okay, so a couple of notes on cargo test. Here we have the it works function. I'm just going to copy it again, create a second one, and I'm going to copy it again. But this one won't fail. It'll I don't know, actually works. Oh, won't return a result here. We'll just do an assert equals. Assert equals. We'll say 2 plus 2 equals 4. So this one's just going to succeed. Say that these two tests, I'm not really looking at this functionality in my library as of now, and I just want to run this actually works. Something that cargo test allows us to do is, let me just clear the console, we can do cargo test and then the specific name of our function. So actually works. Now you'll see that this will run, running on test, it succeeded. We got an OK, and we see that we had 2 filtered out, so it didn't run the other 2. Let's say that instead, I want to run these 2, but I don't want to run this test, so I just want to filter this one out. How do we do it? Something that Rust allows us to do is we can do cargo test, and then maybe you saw at the beginning, you can just specify part of the name. So it. Right now, it works, and it works too. Both have it in their name. So if we cargo test it, we see that we ran it works too, and it works. Of course, they both failed, and we get then the detailed, we get the detailed error message for it works too, we get the detailed error message for it works, and then the summary with just one filtered out. Okay, so that's running specific tests and running multiple tests. Okay, so the command line options that you just saw me run, they go to the cargo test command. But Rust also allows us to have command line options. They go to the test binary, and we separate them by 2 dashes. Okay, so for example, all tests by default, they run on multiple threads. Okay, so they run on parallel. This just makes it so that your code runs faster. But say that we want to run these 2 tests. So this option goes to cargo test, and we want to run then concurrently. So without, well, I guess on just one thread. That's what I'm trying to say. So something we can do is we can say cargo test. Again, we say it. Now we separate by 2 dashes, and we say that test threads is equal to 1. Okay, so we're just running on one thread. They won't be running in parallel. They will be running in sequence. Now, if we do this, we're just running on one thread, and of course, this is pretty simple, so we don't really see much of a difference in time. But it runs slower. It ran slower, and we get the output that we'd be expecting when with one filtered out. Now, say that these 2 succeed. Okay, so they both run just fine. Now cargo test, they both succeeded. Now let's try to add a print line message. Okay, so I'll say print line, and I'll say this will succeed. And if we cargo test it, you see that we're not seeing the print line that we just created. And that's by default cargo test behavior. So it blocks, it captures everything that's printed to standard output. But we can change the behavior by saying show output. Now if we run it, we see that we get this will succeed. Okay. I guess one last option that I want to go over is that we can, another option, say that we want to filter this out, is we can add ignore. Okay, so ignore, whenever you just do cargo test, by default, it will ignore this test function unless otherwise specified. So if we come back here and now I'll remove the cargo test it. So now we don't have any options that go to the cargo test command. We just have these that go to the test binary. And if I run it, we see that we just ran these two, right? This one didn't run, it was ignored, and now we see that we have one ignored. Okay. Say now that you don't want to run the other two. You just want to run. You don't want to run these it works functions. So you just want to run the ignored ones. So something you can do is you can do -- ignored, and you'll see that we just run actually works. So we have two filtered out, it passed, and it's all working nicely. So yeah, I think this is about it for the notes that I wanted to make on cargo test. Again, go through the docs and experiment yourself. There's a bunch of stuff that you can do. Actually, if you want to see, you can do cargo. So if you want to see options that go to the cargo test command, you can just do -- help, and it will show you everything. And if you want to see options that go to the test binary, you can just add the separator and then -- help, and you'll see it as well. Okay, so try it out, have fun. Okay, so for the demonstration purposes of all test features, we created sort of these isolated functions that are not really testing any functionality from our library itself, but are just well, demonstrating. So let's just erase all of this. And usually what you would do with your own libraries is you would write your code here. So say you would write, now I'm just going to create sort of a nonsense example for demonstration. But say we have this function called print stuff, which just prints print lines stuff. What we would do here is then we would create a test function, which would, well, of course, test print stuff. And people have been asking me to put spaces here, so I'm trying. But anyway, that aside, in here, then you would then test your test function. Okay. And yeah, so if we cargo test, we get an error. Print stuff not found in the scope. Oh, of course. So what you have to do is you have to import everything that's outside of your mod tests. And to do that, we just say super star. Okay, so right now print stuff should be visible. Perfect. So let's cargo tests. And everything is okay. So this is usually how you would write your tests. Or should I say your unit tests. Okay, so these are called unit tests because they test sort of isolated modules. They test modules in isolation. And I skipped these two lines in the beginning, but now we can go back to them and say that this mod tests is sort of, I guess, what qualifies that this is a unit test. And this, it's a configuration test. What it does is that this doesn't always compile. So if we run cargo build, it won't compile this part of the code. Rather, it only compiles with this test configuration. So it will only compile when you do cargo test. Okay, so this is a unit test. Quick thing I wanted to add, you see that here I added the pub keyword, but I didn't really have to. Unit tests, they also work with private functions. And yeah, so you can see this will run just the same. So yeah, usually with libraries you make them public so that your other code can use it, but yeah, you can also test private functions just fine. Okay, now let's make this function public again, because instead of unit tests, we'll be performing integration tests. And what integration tests are well, just like other people would use a library, okay? And for that, we create a folder called tests, which is handled specially by cargo tests. So it has to be named this way. And in here, we can create as many integration tests as we like. Say I'll create integration, if I can spell, 1.rs. Now this integration 1.rs the way that we would set it up is first we would import our library. When I created the library, I did cargo new testing lib. So the library is called testing. So I'm importing it right here, and here we would just create our functions. So note that I'm not putting creating a module called tests. I'm not doing any of that. I'm just writing the attribute test and then creating the functions right out of the box. Okay, and that's because we do want them to compile, right? It's just like any normal code would run our stuff. So there you go. We imported testing, and now we can test print stuff again. So we'll just say print underscore stuff. Oh, of course, we have to use it from testing. So there. Now let's clear this and let's cargo test. When we cargo test, we see that now we have more sections. So we have our normal unit test saying test print stuff, and we have this one, test print stuff again. Oops. Perfect. Now if we go to our Finder, and so where I'm at is this is the library file that I created with cargo new. I can go to target, debug, and if I click on, oh no, right here, so debug, you see that we have this executable. And the point that I'm trying to drive here is that each one of your integration tests is going to be compiled as its own crate. Okay, so you can see here is running test one, test print stuff again. Okay, so if I were to create a new file, integration2.rs, hopefully I can do this before my computer dies, and I just say again, there we go, and I cargo test it, we see, okay, of course we'll see again here, but if we open Finder again, we have another one, and this is our integration 1, this is our integration 2. Okay, so several crates, and let me just charge my computer and I'll be right back. Okay, so I told you that every file in this tests folder will be compiled as its own crate. But what if I wanted to create a file in here that would also be used for testing, say setup file, but I don't want it to compile its own crate. It will just be used in integration tests. The way to do that is via submodules. And so say we want to, in integration 2, we want to call this setup from, say, here. Okay. Let's create a function called common. This will be our module name. And inside of here, I'm going to create a mod.rs. Now this is a little bit different from the convention that I used in, I think it was modules part 2 video, but it stands for the same thing. It's pretty intuitive. And in here, I'll just create a pub function. I'll call it setup. And I will just print line good to go. Okay. Now from the say integrations 2, what I could do is I can I can sort of say that this module common is being created. This module common exists, so the folder makes sense. And in here, I can then say common setup. Okay, so this would just, say in our imaginary example, we'll just set things up so that we can run the test later. And this will not be compiled as a crate. So that's our objective. Let's see what happens. Let's cargo test, and we have a bunch of print lines, so let's just show output. Okay, so we see that our output has been printed. That's perfect. Let's go back to where did we print? When did we start printing? Okay, so here. you see this is our unit test, and it prints stuff, so that's good. And then in here, we start printing our integration test. So we have our success, printing stuff, and we didn't call the setup module from here, so that's all good. But in here, you say, there you go, you have the good to go. So you called your setup function before, and we are not seeing the, we'll say a common.rs or whatever in our test summary. So there you go, goals achieved. And I think that is about it. Now, I know that at the beginning of the video, I said that I wanted to make this short, and I think now it might as well be one of the longest videos in my channel, so sorry about that, but I'll do better next time. Anyway, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.